And hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 220, season 5, episode 7, indecision number 7. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good week. Week here was okay, I would say. Ceasefire seemed to hold. There's some other things going on, of course, as always, but that was good. Fighting increased in the south again. We're back there, much greater forces. Still a heavy and a serious time here. But wherever you may be, and wherever you're listening from or watching from, can you watch? I don't think I've actually posted videos of this. I hope you're doing well. I hope things are going well for you, and I wish you, as always, a wonderful week ahead. So let's get right to it. This week's topic. This week's subject, Indecision 7, is leadership at a price. We've been doing leadership at a price for the last number of weeks. Leadership at a price on Jacob's decision to play the long game. We're going to dive into something which I broached, I think, at some other point in the course of coaching the Bible over the years. And it's dealing with how Jacob deals with what he's going through in this moment. And it's very much about the idea of appreciating what I would call the long game. So leadership itself isn't ever really about instant wins or quick fixes. It's pretty much always about the long game. Enduring setbacks, navigating some uncertainties, and making or trying to make some deliberate moves that ensure your survival and ultimately your success at the end. So at the outset, let me ask you a question. Have you ever faced a situation, and I'm sure the answer is yes, but have you ever faced a situation where the stakes were high or too high, where the outcome was less than certain or absolutely uncertain, and every choice carried cost? We've talked a lot about that because a big part of decision making is appreciating the level of risk and appreciating the potential outcomes from the decisions. Maybe something I mentioned last year when I talked about risk and other points, appreciating the level of regret. There is a relationship between risk and regret. The decision that you don't make, the decision that you do make doesn't turn out, regretting not choosing the other path, the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 that I mentioned before also once or twice, the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 of it. What if I had done this? What if I had done that? And so in those moments when the stakes are high and the outcomes are uncertain and everything has risk, so what we've been talking a lot about, and what I'll ask you again here, is how are you leading in those moments? What's your style? What's your approach? What's your temperature in those spaces? Jacob faces this exactly. This is his exact challenge. He's betrayed by his father-in-law on his wedding night. By extension, he's betrayed by the woman he thought he was being married to and her sister. And I would imagine that he has every reason to walk away, except that he can't. Because he really has no place to go. And instead of walking away, he chooses to play the long game. And playing the long game isn't surrender. It's not succumbing. It's actually strategy. Appreciating that this is going to take a longer period of time and a longer stretch of time is a masterstroke of great leadership. And Jacob's managing of this situation is a masterclass, like a lot of these different characters that we've talked about, and how a leader can navigate betrayal, destroyed trust, a level of delayed gratification, and ultimately win in the end. And so for you in your world at this moment, wherever it is that you may lead, what does playing the long game look like in your world? What does that look like? What decisions have you made lately, or situations that you find yourself in lately, that require of you to appreciate and then engage with a much longer time horizon than you initially considered? I think this is where Jacob is. So let's look at his inflection point. When does this happen? Where does this start? How does he dive into this? What's his game? What's his strategy? So Jacob's moment, this defining moment, this inflection point, happens the morning after his wedding. He believes that he entered into an agreement to marry Rachel. Turns out that Laban did a switcheroo on him and switched in Leah for Rachel. And he finds out the next morning that the woman he married was not the woman he wanted, but her sister. And he's upset. Rightfully so. And he confronts Laban. And the answer he gets from his father-in-law is, we don't do that here, where we give the younger before the older. And right there and then, Jacob has to make a decision. Now, it's all well and good that maybe he prepared for this circumstance. We talked, I think, 2 years ago, perhaps, about the idea that Jacob spent an extended period of time before arriving at the home of his mother's brother, at his uncle's home, preparing for life in the exile. But preparing for life in the exile and then executing the life in the exile are not the same thing. And how Jacob approaches the long exile that he's in, whether it's this version, this part of the story, or the next part of the story, or the part after that, or next week's reading where he has to engage again back with his brother, all of these are incredible masterworks in how to deal with these situations where a person is outside of their home turf. And so in this moment where he seems to maybe have prepared for this on some level, he has to decide how he wants to proceed. Is he going to get miffed and leave? Is he going to protest? Or, as he chooses, is he going to play the long game? Because at this moment, his father-in-law has exploited his trust, has betrayed him as a member of the family, and maybe his style, Laban, certainly, but it happens. And it would appear then that Jacob is in an extreme space of weakness and powerlessness. So what should he do? Can he confront Laban now? The idea of risking escalating the conflict, forcing him then to have a wife but no home, no place to work, no place to build a family. He's already far away. His brother is on the prowl trying to get him to kill him. Can he walk away? I sort of mentioned that. He really can't walk away. He has the covenant in play. He just had this incredible dream experience with God. And so Jacob chooses to stay, to close his mouth, to strike continuous bargains, and to play the long game because he sees the bigger, longer picture. And the bigger, longer picture, over the extended period of his life, this is but a small phase. Yes, ultimately it's 20 years. But it's a small piece of the long-range story that Jacob is building, the legacy of his own, the legacy of his children, the future of the nation, the covenant, and so on, is well beyond dealing with being mocked or betrayed by his father-in-law. And so it's about ultimately securing victory over the long term and not necessarily winning every battle, because it would appear that at this moment he has lost the first battle. Maybe he wasn't expecting it that way. Or maybe he wasn't expecting it from Rachel and Leah, and maybe he was expecting it from Laban, but he got it essentially from all of them. And now he has decided and he's chosen to play the long game. Now, how does he do that? How does he play the long game? How do you play the long game? What's your Laban in your life? And so we can dive in here, and probably could have done this last week too, but underappreciating it here, and I think we've talked about this before, is the concept of game theory, and effectively Jacob's rules of engagement. The idea of game theory is effectively providing a framework for understanding strategic decision-making in competitive environments. And it's not just about reacting, it's really about anticipating the moves of others and making choices that always seek to maximize your outcomes. You're playing along with and against the competition at the same time. I always remember the scene from the movie A Beautiful Mind where they're in a bar and he sees this young woman that he maybe is interested in, and the way the movie sets it out is he's appreciating and seeing all the moves that need to be made for the ultimate outcome to be where he's the one ultimately talking to her. And you see the effective interactions, the lines being drawn and connected and being crossed to be able to produce the outcome that he wants. That was John Nash in that movie. Great movie. And so Jacob is now playing chess with Laban. The problem is he's playing this game and he's looking to maximize the outcomes, and he has no power because Laban sets the rules. Jacob's living on his land, working under his terms, married to his daughter. He already knows that Laban is unpredictable. He's already manipulated Jacob once, and can imagine that that's going to happen again. But it's clear as day, that Jacob prepares over the long haul to be ready for the moment when it's time to go. And so he's going to stay quiet. He's going to say nothing. He's going to take whatever it is that is dished out, and he's going to build. And he's going to build slowly. And it's going to look always like he's losing. But he's not losing. Because when it comes time ultimately to leave, and Jacob employs the breeding strategy that he does, which is admittedly somewhat complex and esoteric and difficult to appreciate fully in the text itself, but let's just say that he outwits Laban in the breeding strategy and ultimately comes out significantly more wealthy than anyone expected, to the point where it almost feels like, and it looks like to the children or the others in the camp of Laban, that Jacob has cheated his way to the top. Laban agrees to the entire plan because I think he believes that Jacob's going to fail and that this yokel is not smart enough to handle this situation. He's always going to be the slave to Laban. He's always going to be under his employ. He's never going to be the man standing alone, Jacob, with his own tribe, with his own family, with his own people, and the whole thing. And Jacob, it would appear over the course of time in the field with the sheep as a shepherd, learns a few things about how they breed, or how he can manipulate or manage the situation to get the result that he wants. Perhaps he had divine assistance. Certainly when he talks to Leah and Rachel later on, it seems to imply that through a dream he does learn a little bit, but he does still have to execute, and he does. So Jacob is considering, he's planning, he's thinking, maybe he's even practicing for a future and a version of the future that is many, many steps away, requires the action and interaction of his with Laban and Laban's family, over the course of years, and then he's going to be ready to pivot when the time is right. He's many steps ahead, even though it looks like he's many steps behind. And I imagine on many nights, it felt like he was many steps behind. Because in the long game, there are many long nights. Few victories. But if you're playing chess, part of the game of chess is the anticipatory nature of each step, but it's also survival. Survival over the course of the game, survival over the course of a lifetime, for the ultimate victory at the end. And so I'll ask you, what game are you in right now? Who are the players? How do they play? What can you anticipate being their next moves? Or can you consider all of the different possible moves that they might make based on your experience of them and be out front on those? Or maybe it's an industry that you're in and you see the field for what it is and you see the future of it perhaps differently than everybody else. And people take shots at you, people will mock you, people think you're crazy, but you see it playing out, and now you're looking at the game theory, the table as it's set, the board as it's set up, and you're considering how to handle that. That's Jacob's decision to play the long game. Prepared for a moment that's coming that no one else sees. Now, part two of this is something we talked about actually not too long ago, maybe 3 months ago. Strategic patience. Delayed gratification. The ability for the person to hold and to hold and to hold and to hold until the moment when the great success is ultimately there. Can you endure for the short term, the discomfort of a short term for the long-term success? It's not simply that you're sitting by and waiting and biding your time and you're just simply holding your hands and sitting in a chair in the corner. That's not it. This is a deliberate approach and strategy that is built off of many acts of resilience and a high degree of zoomed in focus. And Jacob exemplifies this in a very big way when he agrees to work for another 7 years. And then another 6 years. It might look like submission. It might look like Jacob's giving up, or he's giving in to his father-in-law. But in reality, it's part of his long game. Because he knows if he walks away at that moment, he has one wife, then he's losing everything. The family, the legacy, the covenant, what he's looking to build, what he's looking to bring into the world, even for his own personal wealth, relationship, success, and influence, that goes out the window if he acts in the moment with too much speed and can't handle delaying that gratification. There is a famous scientific test that was done many years ago called the marshmallow test. The person who did it, I believe, is pronounced Walter Mischel, I believe is how his name is pronounced. And what he did was he basically gave a child the choice to have one marshmallow now, but if they waited a certain period of time, they could get 2 marshmallows. And the study was that later in life, those who actually were able to hold back and wait for the second marshmallow over the course of their lives actually proved to be far more successful. So strategic patience, delaying gratification, isn't waiting for the sake of waiting. It's really knowing about what you're waiting for and then operating and playing in the way that leads you ultimately to that bigger win. You may lose, as I mentioned, some battles along the way. You may get hit. You may end up limping. You may end up hurt. You may have some scars. But ultimately, you come out at the end as the victor. So I'll ask you the question about where you are leading at the moment. What's your version of working the extra 7 years? And what's your goal or the reward that you're seeking at the end of that, that you're delaying this period of gratification, this strategic patience for so long? What goal in your life is so big that it's worth enduring all of the short-term frustrations? I hope there is something like that. I hope there is something that you're working on, that you're building towards, that you're driving at, that's worth the short-term frustration. Something so big, so grand, so hard to see, but you do. In part 3 of this story of Jacob deciding to play the long game, besides game theory, besides delayed gratification, strategic patience, is appreciating how you navigate in the gray areas. Because this is very much part of Jacob's story, and maybe it's perhaps part of your story as well as a leader. Part of what he's doing feels like deception. Or maybe it's outright deception, depending on how you see and appreciate what it is that he does with his breeding strategy. Is he simply just mirroring the competition? Is he playing it at a whole other level? He's playing 3D chess, whereas Laban is simply just playing chess. It raises important questions that every leader has to grapple and deal with in these spaces. Is it justified? Is it okay? Do the ends justify the means? When the situation isn't clear, what's the right answer? What do you do? How do you handle that? Are you touching and dancing on complicated territory? Is it hot lava? Is it warm? Is it cold? Like, what are you doing there? And how do you balance the ethical costs and the potential reward? Last week, we talked about it in the space to some degree, maybe a slightly different vertical with respect to Rebecca. 2 weeks ago, we talked about it on some level with the story of Sarah, appreciating in the gray spaces how you navigate and operate in those spaces. What's the risk reward? What's the decision that you're sitting on? What's the inflection point that you're on two sides of in your debate as to how to handle it? Knowing that there's no right necessarily. Knowing that there's no perfect, certainly. And so for Jacob, the stakes are high. He's fighting not just for his future, but he's also fighting for the covenantal promise. Yet it comes with clear relational, familial fallout. Laban resents him. The rivalry and the difficulty between his wives, and I think by extension into his children, intensifies. And then this, as a person who is not a simple person, but a pure person. At least that's how we initially saw Jacob in the past. This is hard. This is living in what you might call the real world. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, in his talks on this week's portion on this, talks about Jacob stepping into the real world. And this is the real world. And how do you operate as an ethical, value-based leader in a space where you're no longer sitting among people who operate and live and exact their behavior in the way that you did? When you're coming out of the cookie cutter life and moving into everything else, how do you do that? If you remember that experience, a little bit I remember that experience. The first time I remember, it's not a perfect example, but after 12 years of private school, right, in my community, more actually, because preschool as well, every weekend in the synagogue with family and friends, I lived in some level of bubble. So I remember the first experience I had outside of that bubble was summer school after an additional year away at a yeshiva 6,000 miles away in Israel. I spent summer school, the summer semesters at Brooklyn College, and working on Wall Street. And I was way out over my skis. like the people, the language, the priorities, the backgrounds, the history, just everything about it for me was like so new. And I don't think I was so ready for it. And so here in this space and the gray areas, you have to think about the costs that come into these decisions, the preparedness or lack of preparedness that you have, the compromises that you may have to make in your journey to be able to succeed in those moments, in those spaces. How do you choose to react, and how do you make these choices that you know are going to have impact on your relationships, on your values, on your goals, on your soul, on your being? And how do you manage the emotional toll of leading in these uncertain and effectively high-stakes environments? And so there are tools for that. We can't go into all those tools today. But there's positive psychology for navigating against adversity. There's emotional intelligence, appreciating what emotional intelligence is, where you're learning to regulate your emotions under pressure. There's a lot that can be done. That's for another time. But these three things, the game theory, the strategic patience, the operating in the gray, this is all part of the challenge of the long game of leadership that Jacob is playing, the journey that he's on. The success isn't about quick and immediate wins. It's about endurance. It's about strategy. It's about vision. It's about focus. It's about attention to the long-term success. And so I'll ask you, what's your long game? What's the thing at the end of it that you're playing for? It could be anything. But it has to be big enough that it's worth playing the long game for. That could be family, it could be friends, it could be communal, it could be business, a level of wealth and success, a level of freedom, a level of happiness, love, fun. I don't know. That long game is personal. Maybe there's something you're developing, a product or a program or a way of being or something. And that's your long game. And so that's important, figuring out what's the game. Appreciating who are the players in that game. Who's Laban? What's the 7-year work that you're going to have to do? Who's an ally? Who's a potential enemy? Who is a source of inspiration, motivation, energy? Who is someone that's sapping you of those things? Who's not a help as you navigate the different steps in the game? What are their next moves and what are your next moves? And how do you learn to stay patient, strategic, and focused on the bigger picture? How do you do that? That's how you play long games. You know, sometimes we're playing a board game, we want to appreciate the game because we want it to end, and let's play the fast version of it. But sometimes there's a beauty in playing a slow, long game. Watching as every step develops, as every move leads to the next move. To see how the pieces form and how they cross over each other and interconnect and touch and then separate, and you're moving on to the next one. Someone looking at that might think it's chaos, and another person looking at that might think it's opportunity. And leadership isn't about instant wins. It's about enduring the setbacks, navigating the complexity, and playing this very, very long game. And so it's important that you step into your game. Do not miss the game. Step into the game. Proactively, actively into the game. And play the parts, play the roles, do the things. Make the moves, but think strategically, lead patiently, and then ultimately own the outcome, because that's how leadership works, that's how leadership wins, and that's how you succeed ultimately in the end. To finish out with a quote, as we always try to do, here's a quote from Sun Tzu. In the midst of chaos, there is always opportunity. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, in this Indecision series, and I've loved some of the comments that I've gotten over the last number of weeks on this, and the conversation that has surrounded these subjects and these topics and these people, by all means, keep it coming. Have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you next week.